Lecture 7, Israel's Long Decline. We've talked about now the major eras in Israel's history, proceeding from creation and Abraham, the patriarchs, to Exodus and Joshua, and last lecture, Judges and the Kings, recognizing that already the pattern has begun, an endless cycle of Israel sinning, facing the consequences or judgment for their sin, calling for a deliverer, and God now providing that deliverer. Where we're headed, sadly, is towards the exile. Judgment is coming, and it will be harsh. But in the meantime, we're actually extending the pattern of the book of Judges. And in this sense, then, Judges provides us a very good grid, a helpful grid for understanding the cycle of what's happening. You recall that the cycle went from judgment because of sin, turning then to repentance, people recognizing the desperate situation they're in, calling for deliverance, God sending a judge, but then after the deliverance comes a return to rebellion that returns back again to judgment, and the cycle goes on. But we also discuss here that it's not just a cycle in going around in a circle, but there's actually kind of a spiral effect that happens. That as the story progresses, things are moving inwards and it's getting worse with time. And that's the pattern, unfortunately, sadly, that we follow when we continue into the Kings. Judges ended with the summary that in those days there was no king in Israel, every man did what was right in his own eyes. Well, is it possible then that a king could be the solution to Israel's problem? And if we walk then into the historical books, we see now a pattern of the kings, an entire set of or list of genealogies and the dynasties of the different kings as we proceed across Israel's history. This recorded in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Let me start by just giving an overview of Israel's history in terms of these kings. And let's get an overview of what's happening with the kings and the lines of the kings. Of course, the story starts with Saul and the failure, the complete failure that is Israel's first dynasty. But following this, God puts a new king in place, David, a man after God's choosing, a man after God's own heart or God's desire. And David's son, Solomon, the wisest king that Israel ever had to this point. So this is kind of the height of Israel's blessing in terms of kings. Righteous kings who are faithful to God and putting in place his law. The thing is, I have to say even what I just said with a bit of qualification, because at the same time that they were righteous kings, they also failed. You know about the failure of David, and certainly the failure of Solomon as well. And it's as a result of that then that God warns Solomon that soon this dynasty will be punished. His descendant will face judgment from God. That descendant is Rehoboam. And in Rehoboam's day, immediately after the transfer from Solomon to his son, there's a split in the kingdom. Jeroboam, together with the northern tribes of Israel, breaks off. And the result of this that we'll return to a bit later is now God's people that should have been and were intended to be unified around the one reality of who he is, his law and his wisdom. Now they're broken into two halves. This is a horrifying reality. And worse still, the northern kingdom is not just broken off, but it's actually built on, from the very beginning, idolatry. Jeroboam I, out of concern for Israel, the northern kingdoms, going down to Jerusalem and worshiping there, and the possibility that he might lose their loyalty, sets up his own alternate kingdom, an alternate worship in the northern kingdom. So the idea now is, well, people can worship Yahweh without ever leaving the north, and that then will preserve my power. And you can just see that things continue downhill from there, down to this point, a name that you're familiar with, Ahab and Jezebel. And this is an interesting or important point in Israel's history, because as a result of choices by Jehoshaphat, an otherwise righteous king, but choices to ally himself at times with Ahab, it's actually the attempt to unify in some way the split kingdoms. The result of this is there's actually a connection between the two lines. And for a moment, the daughter of Ahab, Athaliah, rules on the throne in Judah. She's also mother to some of the future kings. And therefore, you've pulled in some of this, which primarily the northern kingdom, this wicked line has now joined in together with the southern line and become part of now the dynasty and the effect, the influence that it has on Israel or Judah's history going forward. This continues down until what you find that Israel is destroyed and the kingdom, the northern kingdom, essentially just ceases to exist. Judgment at the hands of the Assyrians, and God allows that to come about in 722. Israel, on the southern side, Judah, continues onward for a few more generations. And it's really only much later, 605 and into the beginning of the 500s, that Judah is destroyed as well in the exile. A couple of comments or things that will help you to know about this then. When scripture refers to the northern kingdom, you'll also often read the language of Israel. Israel referring to this kingdom, the north, and it's the more rebellious of the two. You're going to find a pattern, and we'll look at a bit later, that Israel is primarily idolatrous and rebellious to God all the way through. On the other hand, the other side is often referred to as Judah. And the southern kingdom, or Judah, often is acting more righteously. It's more of a mixture. It's kind of back and forth between the two sides of obedience to God and rebellion against him. Summarizing some of that information, the northern kingdom, primarily rebellious. Other names that you're going to hear for the northern kingdom, Israel, Ephraim, sometimes Joseph. Whereas on the other side, you're going to hear the southern kingdom referred to as Judah. There's also a link with the Davidic line on the southern side. And finally, the dates in which each kingdom was destroyed. But there are other ways to see or to diagram and understand what's going on between these two kingdoms. This diagram is a bit overwhelming, but very helpful. What you've got at the top of the diagram is Israel, the different kings of Israel. On the bottom of the diagram, the kings of Judah. So there's the split between the two kingdoms. You can recognize here in the middle the various prophets, Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, and even the Old Testament books as they fit around these events. So Isaiah and Micah and Jeremiah and Habakkuk and Joel. And you can see then how each one of these overlaps chronologically with what's going on at that time. It can be very helpful if you're working through, for instance, Isaiah, to recognize the timing that Isaiah is overlapping with the end of Israel and then the beginning or some of the difficult times in Judah. And just to recognize the kings that are reigning at that time and some of the struggles that are going on politically and for the people. One other diagram that captures something of these concepts. Here, again, a lot of information packed into the diagram. The feature I would just like to highlight that I find interesting about this diagram is the line here. And this is an attempt to represent, in some kind of graphic way, the spiritual state of each one of these kings. So as you're watching across Israel, the northern kingdom, the rebellious kingdom, you can see that there's very little in terms of obedience to God. And there's one tiny beginning of a kind of a response temporarily, some kind of obedience from Jehoash. And at one point in his life, he turns to God and God delivers him, though later he rebels and judgment comes. In the case of the southern kingdom, you can find a bit more up and down, the spiritual state rising and crashing as Israel proceeds through its history. And what then is the theological point of all of this information and understanding what's happening in Israel's history? Well, that's the significance of the biblical records that we have for these books. I mentioned before that these books are recorded in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And it's helpful for us to get an overview there as well of the main content and the main theological message of each one of these books. 1st Samuel is recording the story of King Saul and the story of David's gradual exaltation as God moves David into position to become the future king. 2nd Samuel now sees David in that role as king, his life, his exaltation, but also his judgment for sin. And the book of 2nd Samuel ends little pessimistically, because we see David and the results of the sin working its way out like cracks across his kingdom, destroying things. First Kings, Solomon, the temple, the kingdom divided, the ministry of Elijah. And again, there are many hopeful aspects of First Kings. The joy of seeing the temple finally completed. But that really is dashed by the kingdom being split in two through Rehoboam's failure. Second Kings records the ministry of Elisha. It's the rest of Israel and Judah's history until both are destroyed in the exile. And when you get to the end of Second Kings, very distressing, very pessimistic, a profoundly low point in Israel's history. Now, these four books work together as kind of a whole, and they're giving us a unified story that is even unified beyond just these four books. Something that's interesting here is a kind of continuous flow of thought that moves from Joshua all the way through 2 Kings. A pattern here that we're supposed to notice, one of those just as a literary pattern. You'll find that at the beginning of four of these books, you have a parallel pattern after the death of, and it's one of God's leaders. After the death of Moses in Joshua 1:1, it's the very first verse of the book. Judges 1:1, after the death of Joshua. 2 Samuel, after the death of Saul. And finally, after the death of Ahab, 2 Kings chapter 1. And that pattern, I think, is there to show you some kind of continuity between these books. Actually, the pattern extends even further back. Not this pattern, but this concept extends all the way back into Deuteronomy. And I think some of what we're supposed to recognize here is a continuous story from Deuteronomy that anticipates Israel's history and predicts how the story is going to play out through Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and how the story actually played out. These books are intended to stand together and to be interpreted together as a continuous story all the way across. On the other hand, if we continue with the historical books, we come to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which in many ways tell the same story, but from a different vantage point. So that 1st Chronicles will record the rise of David's kingdom. Well, that sounds quite similar to 2nd Samuel. 2nd Chronicles will record Solomon, the temple, the long decline of Judah's kings, the exile, and the beginning of a return. And a couple of differences then that stand out between 1st and 2nd Chronicles and the other historical books in this section of the Old Testament. First, it's good to know that 1st and 2nd Chronicles are focused only on the southern kingdom, Judah, the Davidic line, and very critically linking the whole story of Israel with those Davidic promises. It's tracing the promises God made to David and what that means for the nation. The failure of Israel's kings to be faithful to God's word, and therefore the reality that they're judged. And yet the reality also that God's purposes continue and remain. He has not given up on Israel, especially because of his commitment to the Davidic promises. The other theme you should know about 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a very strong focus on the temple. And you're going to read in these books a beautiful presentation of the dedication of the temple and how God blessed in the temple being built. But it's going to proceed onwards and the judgment that comes when God's people abandon their faithfulness to worship him in his temple and to worship him at all. And the result of that then, ultimately the destruction of the temple, so that the destruction of the temple mirrors the destruction of the kingdom, the destruction of the line of the kings, the destruction of the people, the destruction of the nation. And the temple becomes a very fitting picture, kind of a physical barometer measure of what's going on in the kingdom. Israel's rebellion leads to Israel's destruction, just as Israel's failure to worship properly leads to the temple's destruction. One other difference that's interesting about 1st and 2nd Chronicles is that the story extends just a little bit longer. So in the case of 2nd Kings, you end with just destruction. Israel is judged, and there it is. Judah, Israel, both. When you come to 2nd Chronicles, of course, you're focusing only on Judah, not Israel. And there is at the ending the turn upwards that we've talked about, the end of Israel's history that begins a renewed hope, where we're going in our next lecture to talk about the new covenant and the fact that a kind of a hope remains. There's a return and a kind of a rising expectation. God's still going to do something for his people. Now, to understand then what's happening within these books, we should know that the books are not just recording information, as in here's a chronology and here's what happens, but the books are theologizing. The books are interpreting. The books are telling us what's going on across Israel's history. And to see this theologizing, or to see the pattern of what the books are teaching us, we can notice first the evaluation statements of each king as we go along. I showed you earlier the timeline, the list of the kings. Well, just recognize as you go that the books will interpret or point out God's view of each king. So he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did what was evil. He did what was evil. I mean, the pattern is really striking. Occasionally, you pick up something like, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And then you'll get a qualification, yet not like David, his father. And back to it, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam. Well, here's some hope. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, we're back at it. He did what was evil. He did what was evil. He did what was evil. And this is the pattern as we go through. The overwhelming majority, even of Judah's kings, received this evaluation that they did evil. Occasionally, one of the kings in Judah will receive the commendation he did what was right. And consistently, the kings of Israel consistently rebel. This is a site called Tel Dan. Tel just refers to a mound, a place that archaeologists have discovered. And what you're looking at here are the remains of a city or a city center. But this is the stand for an altar. So this then is the altar that stood in this part of the country, northern region. It's the capital region around then the northern kingdom that was wickedly rebelling against God during this time. Dan, if you recall, all the way back to Judges, was famous for leading the way in idolatry. The story of Micah and the Danites, and the Danites coming and taking an idol, a priest trying to set up a kind of pagan holy place. And this is what the metal frame here is just to depict for us what a statue would have looked like if it were built in stone, of course, but upon this stand. So we have archaeological evidence dating back to around the time, a generation or two before Israel was destroyed, of explicit idolatry, an altar set up in a place where it was never supposed to be set up. And probably just an extension of what Jeroboam had done, Jeroboam the first, in his rebellion when Israel was split apart, setting up an alternative worship center. Here's another evidence like that, or just another illustration of that. This seal, a tiny black stone that would be used for different purposes, for marking things, you press it into wax. This dates from around the time of the destruction of Judah. And what you're seeing in this scene is a classic Babylonian worship scene. It's the god of the moon. And these people then worshiping a pagan god from another nation. But this is found in Israel, most likely belonging to a Jewish family. In fact, depending on how you want to understand the characters, the letters, and some different questions that people discuss, possibly even a family name that's mentioned in the Old Testament in several passages talking about people during this period of time. And the reality or the record of this is to demonstrate for us, even until today, that idolatry was endemic, that idolatry was just wrapped up in Israel and Judah's culture during this time. In fact, there are indications as we look throughout the Old Testament and some of the different evaluations we read, that there are times when you couldn't even know much information about the law. You recall one instance where, as they are repairing the temple, they discover the law of God. And the horrifying thing is that you get the impression they're surprised to learn what's here. When the king heard the book of the law, he tore his clothes. And he cries out, "Go inquire of the Lord what we should do concerning the words of this book that has been found. Great is God's wrath against us because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us." I mean, this book of the law that was supposed to guide Israel's history, and the whole expectation of God for worship and sacrifices in the temple, and the people obeying his righteous guidelines, it's all forgotten. It's lost. Apparently, for entire generations, Israel has become no different than its surroundings. That judgment then, or that sin, is evident across both Israel and Judah, and it results in extensive chaos and ultimately God's judgment on them. In fact, the marvel is not that God judged his people so harshly at the end of this account, the 722 for the north and in 605 for the south. The marvel is that God waited so long, because the judgment that they deserved, the sin that they committed, was so dark. And that kind of calls for a question. Why then did God extend his mercy for so long? Why didn't he judge them any sooner? A couple of reasons that are helpful for us to understand. First, let's recognize that not all of Israel was completely rebellious against God. There's an important pattern across this section or this era of the remnant. There's a moment when Elijah despairs that there's no one left who's faithful to Yahweh. And God replies, "No, I have left still 7,000 in Israel. All the knees who have not bowed to Baal and every mouth that has not kissed him." This is within the northern kingdom. And we're still talking about a small remnant, granted, but 7,000 people that still know God and still insist on obeying and remaining faithful to him. In other words, one of the ideas is that all is not lost. There is still hope. There are still people who desire to be faithful. But I think the core and some of the richest pattern here for seeing God's remaining mercy to the nation, both north and south, is his commitment to the Davidic promises. And just to show you how important this concept of David and for the sake of David is, I just want you to see how many times we're seeing, moving across multiple places across these books, that are using this kind of language: the house of David, or for the sake of David, or these people were not righteous as David was righteous. I'm not intending, obviously, for us to read this. I'm just trying to impress us with how much of this there is. And part of the pattern is a king will be evaluated according to David, his father. Did he do what was right, like David, his father? Of course, focused here on the southern kingdom. But it's more than that also. You see patterns like this, 1 Kings 11. "I will be faithful," or "I will grant grace for the sake of David and for Jerusalem's sake." Or, "That David, my servant, may have a light always. I will fulfill my word." And the promise that if you will listen to my commands, I will bless as I blessed my servant David, who was faithful. In other words, one of the core foundations for thinking about this entire section is that people are evaluated according to their faithfulness, like David. And their hope rests even on the fact that God has promised something to David. And if we're reading through, we might wonder, well, why is David so special, or what's so important here? Except we're supposed to recognize the link to those promises. The promises to David that point ultimately to David's son, the descendant of David, who will be the hope of the world. The promises, the hope, the expectation, then, is that with all of these kings, we're waiting for a king who will come, who will finally be righteous. All the earthly kingdoms, even the children of David, the Davidic line, the earthly kingdoms have failed. When will we have a righteous king? And the hope of this section of scripture is the righteous king is coming. He will be a son of David. but he will be more righteous than any son of David that ever came before. That leads me then to two other sections in Israel's history. We've talked about the history of Israel's kings. But the point of the Old Testament is both to record what happened and also to theologize or to interpret or to tell us what it means. We've already seen within the historical books a great deal of this theologizing or explanation. But there are two other sections of the Old Testament in this central part that give us a theological explanation, and they are the wisdom books and the Psalms. Now, in each one of these cases, these sections extend not just, it's not really intended just to focus on the period of the kings. It's covering all of Israel's history. But in the process then, what we're going to learn is the interpretation or how we ought to understand what's happening in Israel's story. And how we ought to understand then what that tells us about obedience to Yahweh. In the case of wisdom, we're going to learn how Israel, or how any person who follows God, ought to conduct themselves. What does it mean to live well? And in the case of the Psalms, we'll receive a full interpretation, both of the joys and the beauty of what God has given and how he's blessed Israel, the expectations of the coming Messiah, and yes, even also the sorrows, the lament, the sadness that results because of sin. If the role of the New Testament epistles is to interpret the events of Jesus' life and death, the interpretation or the theologizing to tell us what it means because Jesus has died, here are the results. I think part of what's going on in Wisdom and Psalms is something like that, together with the prophets, which we'll come to in our next lecture, interpreting and giving us a lens for how to understand what's going on in the history of Israel and in the history of the world. So let's start first with wisdom, and just to understand what wisdom means and the role it plays in the Old Testament. An initial idea. What is wisdom in the first place? And the answer goes that wisdom is teaching us how to live well. But what would it mean to live skillfully? What would it mean to be blessed? And to borrow from the Psalms, an idea like the man who is like a fruitful tree planted by streams of water that brings forth its fruit in its season, who prospers always. What would that look like? And the answer of the wisdom books is that God alone grants wisdom. One of the most beautiful songs describing that, Job 28. There is a mine for silver, there is a mine for gold, and people they go to full lengths to find this kind of treasure. But verse 28 verse 12, where will wisdom be found? Where is the place of understanding? And man doesn't know its worth. It can't be found in the land of the living. But climactically and beautifully returning to the question in verse 20, from where then does wisdom come? And the answer is, God understands the way to it. God knows its place. When he created the world, he set up wisdom. And he concluded here at the end of the chapter, God said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To turn away from evil is understanding. In other words, the beauty of the wisdom books and the beauty of the Old Testament category of wisdom is that we discover only in the law of the Lord will we find the guidance to know how to live well. Now, it's helpful to understand the distinction between the wisdom books and the role each one plays. There is a difference here on the one side between what I'll just refer to as reality simplified, kind of bringing it all down in simple terms to make it very clear that how would one walk faithfully to God, the general results that follow when you fear the Lord. And reality simplified in Proverbs and the Song of Solomon, it makes it just very simple and clear. If you follow the Lord, you will be blessed. If you disobey God, you will be punished. And that's simple. The other side of the coin, however, is reality that perplexes. And on this side, you have Job and Ecclesiastes, the fact that sometimes you do obey the Lord, and yet sometimes difficulty still comes. And it's not as simple then as just saying, do the right things and you get the right consequences. Obey God and everything will go well. Well, it's not that simple. Sometimes you do what's right and you still suffer. The wisdom books together help us to understand how to handle that reality, how to interpret it, and what to do. Not to despair, but to recognize that God alone gives wisdom both for the joyful times and for the difficult times. I'd like to make just one more link in respect to wisdom, and that is that wisdom points ultimately to Christ. Christ is the center of wisdom, and Christ is the source and the point of the wisdom books. Ecclesiastes ends with a comment that wisdom comes from one source. Wisdom is given by one shepherd. And you're inclined at that point to think, okay, Solomon. But if you actually chase that out and you connect it to Job 28 and the other major passages across the wisdom books discussing wisdom, then it's going to point you to more. God is the ultimate source of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the source. I'd just like to highlight, if you move across to the book of Matthew, you find a very interesting kind of parallel here. Language like this, call no man your father on earth, you have one Father who is in heaven. Okay, God the Father. But watch this, do not be called instructors, you have one instructor, the Messiah. And what I discover is that Jesus has a role that is ultimately parallel or equal or entirely the same as God himself. Jesus is the source of wisdom. And if I move further out from here into the New Testament interprets this even further. The very, very strong pattern of associating wisdom ultimately with Jesus Christ, both as the source and the point. Though the Jewish authorities and the people reject, Jesus affirms wisdom is ultimately justified of her children. Jesus affirms that though the queen of the south came to hear Solomon and all of his wisdom, greater than Solomon is here. People hear Jesus' words and they want to know, where did this wisdom come from? What wisdom has he gotten, and how can he speak with such brilliant wisdom? Where is the wise? Where is the wisdom of this world? And the answer goes that the foolishness of the cross shows us Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Jesus Christ is the wisdom of God. And as a result of that, in Jesus Christ, we have received, he has been made for us, wisdom, righteousness, sanctification, and redemption. So that when the apostles speak, they speak the hidden wisdom which God ordained. Not the words of man's wisdom, but the wisdom which the Holy Ghost teaches. The wisdom of this world is foolishness, but God transcends that wisdom with his true wisdom. It's the wisdom of Jesus Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And when we reach revelation and the praise of eternity, what are people crying out? But worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power, riches, wisdom, strength, honor, glory, and blessing. Who is the source of wisdom? Where will we find wisdom? The answer is Jesus Christ fulfills wisdom. But finally, I would like to point us to the Psalms. And what we're talking about with the Psalms is Israel's worship. If you want to think of the Psalms as Israel's songbooks, Israel's hymnal, but the record also of Israel's experience of worshiping God and what it means then to live faithfully and obediently to him, the Psalms are going to record that from the heart response before God. I will introduce an idea here that is tied to the Psalms, but also tied to the entire Old Testament. And it's critical for your understanding of the Old Testament and knowing how to interpret what's happening. This graph represents something called intertextuality. That's a technical word for just the idea that the Old Testament quotes or gives the quotations that the New Testament then uses. And if you look across the graph, what's happening here? On this side of the graph, you're seeing the New Testament. So these are New Testament books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and so forth. On this side of the graph, these are Old Testament books. And the lines that are drawn across, let's say we'll start here with Matthew, moving from Matthew across to Jeremiah, moving from Matthew across to the Psalms, are demonstrating places where Matthew has taken an Old Testament quotation or an Old Testament passage and used it. For instance, you can look in Matthew chapter 2 and you'll find 4 examples of this. Matthew saying that it was a fulfillment of the prophecy in Micah 5 that out of Bethlehem the Messiah would be born. A bit later, out of Egypt I have called my son. Or a bit later, he will be called a Nazarene. And you can go right through Matthew finding myriad examples of it was fulfilled and then a quote. Or you could go to Romans 15 and you could find Paul giving 4 quotations, one after another, drawn mostly from the book of Isaiah. And he's drawing out these quotations to say, things that the Old Testament told you would happen, they have happened. God is fulfilling his word. Now, what I'm wanting you to understand or appreciate about this pattern then is just to appreciate how often and how richly, how many different places and in many different ways the New Testament draws from the Old Testament and quotes these passages. In some cases it will be explicit. In some cases it will say, this fulfilled what was written by Jeremiah the prophet. In other cases, it'll be more subtle. Sometimes language gets picked up and used. There's no reference to tell you that it's an Old Testament passage, but if you know both places, you can definitely see this is it. And what we're talking about in all of these instances across the graph, we're talking here about thousands of times. I mean, the clear incidence of something like it was fulfilled, it was written, a couple of hundred, which is already a lot, including all of the echoes or allusions in the thousands. The New Testament constantly draws from the Old Testament. In the Psalms is one of the greatest examples of this. The Psalms is one of the sources that the New Testament draws from the most. And all of the themes of the Old Testament appear here. Creation, Israel's history, the law, Israel's sin, the covenants, the Messiah, the eternal victory. All of those major themes are carried in the Psalms, and then they're carried right into the New Testament as the New Testament begins to quote these passages. One of the biggest patterns I want you to know about is the concept of the Messianic Psalms. And the concept here goes, many of the Psalms that we read and we assume are talking about David's struggle, or that we find comfort in, an appreciation for how we can handle our own struggles and how we come to God. There's actually even more going on than just that. What I just said is a valid enough way to read these passages, but there's also something going on that points to Jesus. We call these Messianic Psalms. And the major Psalms you should know about, Psalm 2, 8, 22, 45, 89. These Psalms it's critical for understanding what's happening here, to appreciate that the ultimate fulfillment is Jesus Christ. Other Messianic Psalms, a little bit more of minor Psalms, but still pointing to him. And the way that we know that these Psalms point to him is because the New Testament will quote them and connect them to Jesus Christ. Let me show you a few examples of what that looks like. Psalm 2, there is a son who reigns together with Yahweh over all the earth. Psalm 8, man is to reign over all creation, ultimately the human Jesus Christ. Psalm 16, God will not abandon his soul to Sheol or let him see corruption, pointing to the resurrection of Christ. Psalm 22, the mockers divide his garments, and they even quote from the psalm unknowingly as they mock him. Psalm 34, none of his bones are broken because he takes refuge in the Lord. Psalm 45, God's throne is forever and ever, cited in Hebrews, referring to Jesus Christ. Psalm 72, his dominion is from sea to sea. Psalm 89, the question whether God has abandoned his promises, and the answer is no, ultimately. Psalm 110, the king sits beside Yahweh in victory over his enemies. Psalm 118, the stone that the builders rejected is now the triumphant one. Psalm 132, as God promised, he has prepared a place forever for his anointed, for his Messiah. And in each one of these Psalms, the beauty of this is to understand and appreciate the ultimate fulfillment, these Psalms pointing to Jesus. Let me just go into one psalm and show you kind of the richness of these connections and what it looks like. This is Psalm 22. It's very familiar to us with language like this, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And that's starting out right at the beginning of the psalm. Of course, that's exactly what Jesus quoted as he died. It's not just Jesus' words, though. Jesus speaks elsewhere, I thirst, and that fulfills one of the details of this psalm. Or we find Jesus speaking, I will tell of your name to my brothers, quoted in Hebrews 2, pointing to believers. It's not just he, though, because you also find his accusers. They derided him, wagging their heads. They said, he trusts in God, let God deliver him now. I mean, they actually accidentally quoted from this psalm. And they did things that the psalm points to. They pierced his hands and his feet. They divided his garments among them. Detailed fulfillments and specific ways demonstrating that what God said would happen is exactly what happened. Beautifully, the results also accrue, because the end of the psalm is triumphant. All the families of the nations will worship before you. The world will worship Jesus Christ, the victorious King. And all of that is contained in this psalm, pointing richly and beautifully to him, the King of the world. I'll just summarize then what we've talked about. We've discussed Israel's history and a distressing period of sin, rebellion, and failure. And yet at the end of it, a seed of hope, a kind of a confidence that underlies all of it. Yes, Israel has sinned, Israel has failed, but God made some promises to David. A king is coming, a righteous king is coming. And unlike all the kings that came before, this king will rule forever and faithfully and obediently. And in him, all the world will be blessed. Wisdom. How would you then walk with God and live faithfully to him? Well, God alone is the source of wisdom. And not just that, but ultimately Jesus is the ultimate source of wisdom. And the Psalms, recording all of the aspects of Israel's life and worship and even failure, all of the themes of the Old Testament drawn up into this book, interpreted and helping us understand what it means and how we respond to God. But underlying all of that, the ultimate fulfillment, the description of the Messiah who will come and who will reign and bring hope to humanity. And if I was going to then apply that or think about what that means for our lives, in each one of these ways, we ought to view ourselves as parallel to the nation. How many times have I failed? How many times have I turned away from God? How many times have I disobeyed him? And yet he's faithful to me. He's gracious and loving. For the sake of his servant David, well, let's see the ultimate fulfillment. For the sake of David's greater son, I am in Christ, and God mercifully shows grace to me over and over again. But it's not just then that I'm parallel to Ahab and Manasseh and the other wicked kings, because something different is going on here. God gives to me wisdom. God gives to me the hope of the Psalms. God gives to me a heart that is prepared to worship him. And I have then the opportunity to follow him obediently. I have the opportunity by his words and by obeying his commands to flourish like the tree that's planted. Even if difficult times come, as in Job and Ecclesiastes, I have a solid rock, a rock that is Christ, upon which my foundation can be set. And I can rejoice, as the Psalms do, praise the Lord for the great things that he has done and is doing and will do. So the Psalms, wisdom, the history of Israel. These things are written, Paul says, for our instruction. Read these, love these, respond to these books. And in the light then of what we learn, remain faithful to Yahweh, remain faithful to Jehovah, remain faithful to Jesus Christ until he returns.